So I thought we would begin this week by really going back over at first the things from last week, and particularly the things in chapter 41, because chapter 41 is the focal point of the dimensions that are mentioned all the way through Ezekiel's prophecy, well, all the way through this section of Ezekiel's prophecy, and it's the temple itself, as we said. So if you just quickly turn then back to Ezekiel and chapter 41. And we read in verse 1 that Ezekiel is brought to the temple. And this is the introduction of the section that talks about the temple. And we looked at this last week, but just as a reminder, this is Solomon's temple. I think it's Uncle Lane's drawing, as we said, with its holy place. And again, I'm going to put on the laser. Oh, yeah. This is the holy place and the most holy place and so on, with the posts and the side chambers round the outside. And then we have the floor plan up here, as we said before. And then this is the way that Ezekiel's temple overlays onto the top with the altar. We're told very clearly in chapter 41 that the altar is in the inner court, in front of the temple, we read. And then we read of the porch, and the dimensions that go along with that at the end of chapter 48, chapter 40, verse 48. And then the stairs and the pillars, which are like Jachin and Boaz in Solomon's temple, and then into the holy place, which is 40 by 20 again. And that's important. That measurement is mentioned in Ezekiel, just to spell it out at the end of verse 2, that the length of the nave is 40 cubits and its breadth 20 cubits. That is the measurement that is parallel again with Solomon's temple. And then again, the most holy place. So we read of that in verse 4. He says, and he measured the length of the room 20 cubits and its breadth 20 cubits. And he says, this is the most holy place. So we are told by Ezekiel very precisely where the most holy place is, and it's there with its dimensions exactly the same as it was in the days of Solomon, 20 by 20. And then we thought about the side chambers around the outside again, because Ezekiel describes these. We won't turn it up, but they get larger as you go up. And in both First Kings and Ezekiel 41, we read of the enlarging that happens as the side chambers go up one upon another. And that is because the side chambers rest on the walls. So this is a beam here, and this is a beam here. They don't have hold in the wall, as King said. They just rest on top of the wall. And then both Ezekiel and Kings again mention a winding staircase that goes up between the chambers. And then we touched on these briefly last week. These were a set of links that were given me, and I think they're really good. So I just copy and pasted them straight in. And again, it just shows to us that the paralleling of thought that there is between Ezekiel's record and Solomon's record of the past. Language is picked up straight from Solomon, straight from First Kings, and used in Ezekiel. So we're told that both times that the house faces east. So on the left there is Solomon's temple, and on the right is Ezekiel's temple. And again, we said most importantly last week that in orange there, where it says the forefront of the house stood toward the east, that tells us that the temple is shaped like a house in that sense, with walls and a roof, and that it's got a front, which by necessity means it has a back as well. You know, it's got a front and a back, and also it faces toward the east. Its front faces eastward. That's what we know. They're sort of the overall things, the requirements that Scripture gives us for Ezekiel's temple. And then we're told about the size of the house, Again, the 20 by 60, as we said, in both occasions. And then there's the references for that underneath. And then the size of the porch there at the bottom. And we noted last week that the porch was a slightly different length in Ezekiel's vision. And then the placement of the sea. This is interesting. We only touched on this a little bit. In 1 Kings, there's the laver, in which is the water. In Ezekiel, no laver is mentioned. However, there is the water that goes out from the side of the house there at the top. Ezekiel 47 verse 1, waters issued out from the threshold of the house eastward. From the forefront of the house, they go down and by the right side of the altar. And it seems almost as if that's there as a replacement for the laver that stood there in the past. They're in the exact same position. And then also, if we go down, there's the position of the altar is mentioned very similarly in both. And the folding doors at the bottom there. They're both the doors for entering into the holy place and then entering into the most holy place as well. Both Kings and Ezekiel mention them. So this is important because it means that Kings gives us a foothold for understanding the prophecy of Ezekiel, and perhaps more so now as we move on to the dimensions of the court. But there were, just before we move into the court, there were a few other things from last week that we didn't quite finish. There was more. There were more links here. So the glory of God filling the house, the chambers and the pillars and so on. More links. But another thing we were going to look at last week that we never got round to quite was this phrase, to set your heart upon something. Just turn back to chapter 40. I think we did briefly mention this. Chapter 40 and verse 5 or verse 4. This, the man with the measuring rod speaks to Ezekiel, and he says, "Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and set your heart upon all that I shall show you. For you were brought here in order that I might show it unto you." Set your heart on the things that I will show you. And in fact, it's the same in chapter 44. It's mentioned twice. Chapter 44 and verse 5. It says, "And Yahweh said unto me, Son of man, mark well." And that is the phrase, set your heart upon the walls and so on. And then it mentions it twice in verse 6, the very next verse. Or is it later in verse 5? Yeah, later in verse 5. Mark well the entrance to the temple and so on. Set your heart upon is the Hebrew behind that. And that phrase appears quite a few times in scripture. We won't turn them up, but there they are on the screen. The first one is from the days of David, where he's talking to Solomon. He says, "Set your heart to seek Yahweh, and in the same breath, arise therefore and build the sanctuary." It seems like there are quite a few, especially related with the temple. Set your heart to seek Yahweh and arise therefore and build the sanctuary. And then Psalm 48, which we read before, set your heart upon her bulwarks. That's when it says the phrase that's in our hymn, mark well her bulwarks, consider her palaces. The Hebrew there is set your heart upon her bulwarks. And it's a lovely idea. And there's another random one really in Psalm 62. "If riches increase, set not your heart upon them." And that's like the contrasting idea to setting your heart upon God and upon the things of the future. And Psalm 78, "A generation that set not their heart aright." And then the two in Ezekiel. And then Daniel is put forward as an example, as a man who set forth his heart to understand the prophecy that he read in Jeremiah about the 70 years. But it just reminds us again of why the temple is such an important thing. It's similar to David, to set our affection on the house of God. This was the message that the man gave to Ezekiel here in the vision. This was the message that Ezekiel passed on to the captives by the river Kibar. And this is the same message for us, that we must set our hearts upon these things and upon the hope that we have. That it is the joy that is set before us. The picture of the kingdom, the restoration of Israel, the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the rebuilding of the temple. And it is Psalm 48 that captures the spirit of this idea, and it's why we had it for our reading. We won't read it all, but great is Yahweh and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. And again, there's that phrase at the end, set your heart upon her bulwarks and consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generation following. This psalm is true of Jerusalem throughout all of Jerusalem's ages, like in the past when David was writing, but how much more true will this be in the kingdom age, when Yahweh will be great and greatly to be praised, but in Jerusalem, in the place where he will dwell. And again, we say we cannot make the point strongly enough that it says, set your heart upon her bulwarks. I read one commentator who says this about Psalm 48. He says, become intimate with every aspect of Jerusalem and its message. Transmit this to the next generation, not only the picture of the past, but a picture of a glorious future. And I think that sums up the message of Psalm 48. It's the idea of telling it to the generation following. It's like the sight of the city of Jerusalem appearing on the hills as you walk towards it is an experience that will be so profound that stories will be passed down through generations, through 4 generations to come. That's what it means to set your heart upon something, to tell it to the generation following there, as Psalm 48 says. Just one other piece of context here, back in chapter 40 of Ezekiel, we're told the dating of the vision. And I think this dating is really very interesting, because we read chapter 40 and verse 1, in the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was smitten, in the self-same day, the hand of Yahweh was upon me and brought me thither. Now, it seems to me this beginning of the year, this is the phrase Rosh Hashanah. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It's a festival, and it's actually in the 7th month. And I suspect that this here is referring to the second beginning of the Jewish year. There's actually 2 beginnings of the Jewish calendar, and the second one is actually in the 7th month, and it's called Rosh Hashanah. And the first day of that month is the Feast of Trumpets, there on the screen. And the 10th day of that month is Yom Kippur, and the 14th day is the Feast of Sukkot. These are called nowadays the days of awe in the Jewish calendar. But the 10th day is when Ezekiel is given the vision. He's given the vision in the 10th day of this month, and this of course would be a significant thing if this dating is correct here, because that is the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Ezekiel was a priest, we read in Ezekiel in chapter 1. Ezekiel would have been fasting and remembering his sins, remembering the sins of the children of Israel. And yet he would have been at the temple, as we said, as a priest. If the temple was still standing, he would have been there. But instead, on this day of all days, he's given the vision of the rebuilt temple. It must have been a special day of atonement for this prophet. And again, it makes us think of how Ezekiel himself was connected with the message that he was giving. What did this vision mean for Ezekiel as a prophet? we know, we talked last week that he was personally connected with the vision, in the sense that his wife died as an illustration of the temple, as the temple being the desire of the eyes, and so on. This vision would have been etched into his mind for the rest of his life. So perhaps that's a nice thought there, that perhaps this vision was given on the Day of Atonement. Another thing as well that's important now is the units of measurement. So just come a bit further forward in chapter 40 to verse 5. Or verse 4, verse 5. And behold, a wall outside of the house round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits by the cubit and an handbreadth. So there are 3 measurements that we need to know about. Firstly is the usual Bible measurement of the cubit. This is used, lots of places. But secondly is the royal cubit, and that is from your elbow to the tip of your finger, but then with an handbreadth. And this is what Ezekiel talks about. He calls it a cubit and an handbreadth, and that is known as the royal cubit. And that's this middle one on the screen. And the bigger cubit is the one that appears to be used in this prophecy, the prophecy of Ezekiel, on this section. And it's the royal cubit that is used to make up the reed that Ezekiel mentions here as well. So a reed is 6 royal cubits. And these measurements aren't too bad. We're told exactly what they are. And also, in almost every place, we are told the exact measurement. So we're told this is so many cubits or so many reeds. All you do is read the measurement, and it says whether or not it's cubits or reeds. It's not terribly complicated most of the time. We're just told straight out. But that's it. So if you read reed, then it's 6 cubits. And they're 6 of the bigger cubits. They're called royal cubits. So hopefully that will be useful as we go through. Now, this is the structure of the 3 chapters that we've been looking at for the 2 weeks. So we looked at chapter 41 last week, the temple itself. And this week we're going to look at the courts and the gates, which are in chapter 40. And chapter 42 are the chambers that are inside the temple complex. And we're not going to touch on them very much at all this time, because it just gets too involved in terms of the dimensions. But this is important, just so we've got a picture in our minds. So chapter 40, Ezekiel walks all the way through the courts, through the outer court, into the inner court, and then he's brought in front of the temple. Chapter 41, the temple itself is measured. Chapter 42, all the bits around the temple are then measured. That is the structure that the text follows. And this is a more detailed structure of chapter 40. And I appreciate that in some ways, chapter 40 is a bit drier than chapter 41. But I think the key to the chapter is understanding the structure that is written in. And each different section, because once the structure is there, you can figure out which bit is which and so on, and where each bit fits, and it sort of follows a logical pattern. So the first section you can see in orange talks about the outer court. So it's the outer eastern gate and the outer northern gate and the outer southern gate. And then Ezekiel goes in and he measures the inner southern gate, the inner eastern gate, the inner northern gate, and then the inner court itself. Okay. So it's that structure. And I think I struggled, and we'll see. I don't know what people think, but when I first tried to look at Ezekiel's temple, you sort of begin reading chapter 40 and then you get probably stuck. And it's like a bit hard to get through. The measurements are sort of, I don't know, they just keep coming one after the other. But anyway, we'll see how we get on. But I think when it comes together, it becomes really very exciting. So we'll just start looking at the screen and bearing in mind that structure. Just start in verse 6. because we're told very clearly that Ezekiel comes to the gate which looks toward the east. The gate that looks toward the east, that's where the vision starts. Okay, Ezekiel first of all comes to the outer eastern gate of the court, and he moves inwards from there. And a lot of time, verse 6 to 16, is spent describing everything about the eastern gate. But there's a reason for this. And the reason is because the eastern gate becomes a model or a prototype, you might say, for all of the other gates. Because it turns out that every single gate that's described in the chapter follows the same pattern as the first gate. So it's called it, you understand one gate and you understand all of the gates. So it's like the battle is fought and won in the first few verses. And we know this because when you come down to verse 17, the next lot, we read about the outer court, but then verse 20, is about the northern gate. And we'll just read this. As for the gate that faced toward the north, belonging to the outer court, he measured its length and its breadth and its side rooms, which we'll come to, 3 on this side and 3 on that side and so on. And then its length, but the sides of it were of the same size as those of the first gate, right? They're of the same size, the same measurements as the first gate. We read there in verse 20. That's in verse 21, actually. It says, after the measure of the first gate in the AV. And then if you go to the south gate, in verse 24, it says the same thing. And after that, he brought me toward the south and the gate toward the south, and he measured the posts thereof and the arches and so on, according to these measures, after the same measure as the gate before. And then when you go to the inner gate in verse 28, he brought me to the inner court by the south gate, and he measures now the inner south gate, and he measures that one according to these measures as well. All of the gates have the exact same measurement. And this is very important, really. So there's an outer court and an inner court described in Ezekiel 40. And there's a gate on the east, a gate on the north, and a gate on the south for the outer court, and then also for the inner court. Just come down to verse 47. Where we're told a bit more about the inner court. So in verse, where is it now? In verse 17, we read about the outer court. But then in verse 47, he measures another court. And this is because he's gone inward now into the inner court. And he measures that court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, 4 square. And the altar was before the house. Inside the inner court is the altar, right? And that the inner court is 100 cubits by 100. So the outer court, inner court, the gate prototype, we'll come back to that in a sec, but this is the picture on the screen here. So Ezekiel starts here at the outer court, at the eastern gate. So we're facing east, going that way. And then he goes in there and he measures this gate and this gate, all of the same measures. And then he goes in the eastern gate here and measures this gate here, and this gate here. And he measures the altar in the inner court, okay, which is 4 square. And we read in verse 47 that it was 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad. That is this section here. Okay. And we said that the gates all had the same measurements. Now, those measurements are these. And I appreciate we're trying not to get bogged down in the details here, but just look at the repetition of the phrases in chapter 40. Just see if we can follow them. So verse 20, he talks about the gate. He says, as for the gate that faces toward the north, belonging to the outer court, he measures its length and its breadth and its side rooms. There are 3 side rooms. We'll come to that in a sec. But he measures he says, it's verse 21, its side rooms, 3 on either side, its jambs and its vestibulae were the same size of those of the first gate, right? And then its length was 50 cubits and its breadth 25 cubits. So this is the point. Whatever we think about the gates, they all fit within this very simple thing. The breadth is 25 and the length is 50. So however hard we might find the measurements in Ezekiel 40, there's like an overall thing. All of them have 3 side chambers. All of them have an inward porch. I put there in the middle. That's the vestibulae in this version, and it's called the porch in the AV. And all the gates are the same size. They're all 25 by 50. Just have a look at the south gate. Right, verse 25. It has a porch and windows all around, like the windows of the others. And then it says its length was 50 cubits and its breadth was 25. The same measurements, right? And then also the inner gates, move on a few more. We read about the north gate in verse 35. So now it's on the inner court. So they were the ones in blue. And this one is the same size as all the others in verse 36 at the end. Its length was 50 cubits and its breadth 25 cubits. This is really, really important. So we'll have a look in a sec at what's inside the black box there of the gate. But over the top, if we get lost in the detail, we know that in the end, the gate has to add up to 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. That is the overall dimension of all of the gates, and they're all the same. Also, no western gates mentioned. So we're mentioning the gate on the east, the gate in the north, and the gate on the south. No western gate is mentioned. That's the same in the tabernacle. That's the same in Solomon's temple. Herod added on a few gates to the Temple Mount, but that's never in scripture. And it's the same in Ezekiel's temple. There are no western gates. Let's see if we can follow this through in Ezekiel 40. So all the gates are the same. Each gate is 50 by 25. 50 by 25. And the eastern gate, the outer eastern gate at the start of chapter 40 is described in detail. And then Ezekiel says next time, oh, and that gate is like the first gate, which we first described. It's all the same. And then it does that for the south gate, the north gate, and the other gates, and so on. So the eastern gate then, let's follow this through. So Ezekiel starts here in verse 6 of chapter 40. And we'll just read it. I'm going to use a slightly different version. It just makes the language slightly easier to follow here. But see if we can follow it through. So verse 6, he went into the gateway facing east, going up its steps, and measured the threshold of the gate 1 reed deep. Now 1 reed, if we remember, was 6 cubits. Okay, so I put all of the measurements in cubits here just to make it simple. So 1 reed on the screen, 6 cubits there, the threshold of the gate. And the side rooms, 1 reed long and 1 reed broad. And the side rooms are here, 1 reed by 1 reed. Okay, and he carries on walking through. And then he measures and the threshold of the gate by the vestibule of the gate at the inner end. Ezekiel carries on walking through the gate and comes to the inner end. Okay, it says inwards in the AV. It should be the inner end. That's like he goes inwards, and then he measures the threshold of the gate by the vestibule was also 1 reed. That's this measurement here, and that's in verse 7. And then he measures the vestibule of the gate on the inside, also 1 reed. That's there. I put that measurement on. And then he measures the vestibule or the porch itself, and that's 8 cubits. This is here. And then he measures the posts of it, and that's here. That's 2 cubits. Okay. And now the next bit is very important, because in verse 10, Ezekiel, and this is where it gets confusing, Ezekiel now goes back and describes the side chambers in verse 10. He describes these side rooms here, on this side, and there. So he says about them that there were 3 side rooms on either side of the east gate. So there are 3, 1, 2, and 3. And in fact, I think we missed out a measurement slightly earlier. It said there were 5 cubits between each side chamber. That's it in verse 7. Between the little chambers were 5 cubits there. And the threshold of the gate, again, the porch. So the porch is always at the inner end of the gate. Now, how do we know that this is correct? Okay, that Ezekiel goes back and measures the posts, the little chambers, and so on. And the answer is, well, we're told that there are only 3 side chambers. And again, we're given those overall dimensions, like say for the north gate later on in verse 20, we're told that yes, each gate has 3 side chambers on either side. It has a porch there and so on. We're told about it. But when we add this up, right? So in terms of lengthways, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 6s, which is 30. And it's 2 5s, which is 10, which makes 40 there. And then plus 8 plus 2. In length, the gate is exactly 50 cubits long. That is the overall, do you remember the black box back here? Oh, where's it gone? This is the gate prototype. 50 cubits by 25. And we're told the breadth of the gate in verse it's slightly later on, in verse 13. He measured the gate from the roof of one little chamber here to the roof of the other little chamber here. And he says it's 25 cubits. 25 cubits in breadth and 50 cubits long. They are the overall dimensions of the gate. All the gates have the same measurements. And this is very interesting. To us, this is very hard to see, perhaps, at first. As we read it, we become more familiar with it. But to ancient Israelites, this was very common. The type of gate that's described here is actually called a Solomonic gate, and they're all the way through in the Middle East. And they started cropping up in the time of the United Monarchy, in King Solomon's reign. This is at Megiddo. See here, this gate, 3 side chambers, and there's a curve here. This is going inside the city, but the actual gate itself is there. At Giza, right, you go through the gate into the city, and you have 3 side chambers on either side. The people who Ezekiel was writing to would have known exactly what they were talking about. Hazor. These really make an impression because you can still very much see them today. Here, here, and here, 3 side chambers on either side, exactly the same style of gate. Once you see it's quite easy to figure out what's going on. It's just at first it can be hard. This is Hazor again in real life. The 3 side chambers, and this is the guard chamber at the front. This is another one, slightly less clear. There and there and there and there, and this one's really clear. They built it up on that side. Obviously, so the 3 side chambers. This is a very, very common type of gate, and yeah, it becomes a very familiar sight. And this is the gate that Ezekiel describes. So back to the temple complex again. These side chambers here, or they're not side chambers, this temple complex, these are mentioned in chapter 42. And we're not going to talk about these. In fact, I don't know, we mentioned last week Mark Olfrey's book here. This is really very good. And it describes them in great detail. And I just put this on here. This is his design for the chambers, and I think it works very well. But we're not going to go into detail about that. That's chapter 42. But we just want to review Ezekiel's journey. So he begins at the eastern gate on the outside, and he walks through the gate, right? And then he's given the measurements for the outer court, which we'll come to in a sec. And then he walks through this gate and he sees the altar. Then he walks in here and in here and in here, right? That is overall the journey that we followed Ezekiel go through these temple pictures. That is the journey that Ezekiel takes, ending up in the most holy place. Now, there are two more points of interest on this diagram. Just have a look at verse 19, if you would, of Ezekiel 40. Because we're told Ezekiel gives the measurement as he walks from one gate to the next. So as he walks, say, from the inner end of the outer eastern gate, if that makes sense, to the inner eastern gate, we're told this dimension here, which gives us the dimension then of the outer court, if you see what I'm saying. So in verse 19, and he measures the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate unto the forefront of the inner court without, 100 cubits, eastward and northward. This is the 100 cubits measurement there. And we see actually it's the same as we follow around. It's in verse 23 as well. Opposite the gate on the north, as on the east, was a gate to the inner court. So opposite the gate on the north, there is a gate to the inner court as well. And he measures from gate to gate 100 cubits. That's this length here. So 100 cubits here and 100 cubits here. And then it's the same in verse 27 as well. And there was a gate on the south of the inner court, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south, from gate to gate, 100 cubits. The same measurement again. So that is how we know the dimensions for this outer court here. And then, as we said, the inner court is measured because we know that this, we read in verse 47, was 100 by 100 this way. So this means that we can come up with a size for the inner court and the outer court put together. So don't worry too much about the measurements on the screen. In fact, we're going to go from top to bottom where the arrow is. So we learnt that each gate was 50 by 25, right? So this gate is 50 cubits long. We know that from gate to gate was 100. From the gate again is 50. Okay, do we get that? So this is 50 plus 100 plus 50. That equals 200. Across the inner court is 100. We saw those dimensions before. Across the gate, another 50. Across the outer court, another 100. We saw that again in verse 23. And across the gate again, another 50. So this is, we'll just add these up. That's 50. That equals 150 to there, 200 to there, 300 to there, 350 to there, 400 to there, 500 to there. Okay, for this dimension, it's 500 cubits long. This direction we won't go into in too much detail. This is chapter 42. We haven't got time for this. This is also 500 cubits long, and we can think about that another time perhaps. But we know then that the court is 500 cubits by 500 cubits. That is the measurement that we are given for the court. Now, just turn with me to chapter 42. Because in chapter 42, Ezekiel zooms out and measures the whole thing. He's like given more overall type measurements, and you can see how it all works out. In chapter 42 and verse 15. So we don't want to go into detail about the rest of chapter 42 and get involved in the measurements there, but only just this last section. And this bit I think is really amazing. So chapter 42 and verse 15. He makes an end of measuring the inner house. And he brought me forth toward the gate whose prospect is toward the east. Here, he comes back to the outer gate. He's done measuring. Now he's about to take overall measurements. And he measures the east side here. And he measures it 500 reeds, not cubits, but reeds. So we've said that it's 500 cubits from here to here. However, Ezekiel measures in reeds, which is huge. This is the mile by mile that we talked about, that we perhaps know more familiarly. A reed is 6 cubits, so it's 6 times the size of this. And you think, what's going on here? You know, we've just concluded from chapter 40 that this is actually 500 cubits, but Ezekiel reads 500 reeds, not cubits, okay? And he does this all the way around. He measured the east side with the measuring reed, 500 reeds roundabout, and he measured the north side. So he goes up here, and he up the top, and he measures 500 reeds. And note, it makes the point, every single measurement, it's in reeds, it's bigger. And he measures the south side with a measuring reed, 500 reeds, and he measures the west side, 500 reeds. 4 sides with a wall roundabout, all 500 reeds to make a separation. Here's the problem. The measurements in chapter 40 add up to 500 cubits square. However, Ezekiel's summary tells us in chapter 42 that the measurement is 500 reeds. Now, just hold that thought, because I think this is one of the most exciting things of Ezekiel's prophecy. So that is the problem. Here's Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem in the time of Christ. Now, in Jerusalem here, the eastern gate does not just lead you outside the temple. The eastern gate leads you outside the city. It's unique in that sense, in comparison with all the other gates. If you walk out the eastern gate of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in Old Testament times or in New Testament times, then you go outside the city. If you go out the north gate, you end up in the city. If you go out of the west of Herod's Gate here at the back, you end up inside the city. If you go out south, you end up inside the city. If you go out east, you end up outside of the city, right? And you know, this is we could add to this again, 1st century Jerusalem. If you go out of the eastern gate, you end up outside of the city walls. All of the other gates, you end up still inside the city, pretty much. But the eastern gate is unique in Jerusalem. And this is really nice as well, because the captives by the river Kibar would have known Jerusalem like the back of their hands. Ezekiel would have known Jerusalem like the back of their hands. You know where the east gate was, where the Temple Mount was, right? You know that when you go out the east gate, you go outside of Jerusalem as a whole, and not just outside of the temple courtyard. Jerusalem about 4 BC, the outer wall, the eastern gate, you go outside the whole city. Right? Another picture, the eastern gate, outside the whole city. See all the city spread behind, the Antonia fortress, all the rest of it. Oh, this is the Antonia. Then you go and you end up outside the city. And again, today, this isn't very clear, but look here, city on this side, city on this side, city on this side, the Kidron Valley on this side, outside of the eastern gate, outside of the city, here. Okay, city, the city of David is here, right? And then all of the city of Jerusalem is here. You go outside the eastern gate, there's the Golden Gate, you end up outside of the city. The east gate does not just lead you outside of the temple courts, it leads you outside of the city. So when we read these measurements in the sanctuary, now at the end of chapter 42, we have to zoom out a little bit. I think it looks like this. Here is the 500 cubits. This is the little temple sanctuary that we've been in, but now we've zoomed out. Okay, and Ezekiel goes out the eastern gate and he measures 500 reeds, a much bigger measurement. And you think, where did that come from? But it's there. Now, had he gone out the southern gate or the northern gate, he would have measured 500 cubits. And in fact, other translators can't reconcile this. They've done all the same measurements that we did. The ESV does this. And so it says at the end of chapter 42, oh no, it's not reeds. It can't be reeds. It must be cubits. So they just completely substitute out the word reed and put cubit there because they've done the measurements of chapter 40 and think there's a contradiction. The Septuagint does the same thing. It's sort of, you think, why is it reeds? It shouldn't be, but it is. Outside the eastern gate, 500 reeds. That's that. Now, this 500 cubits, okay, I did a unit conversion and put it into reeds. So there's 6 cubits in a reed. So 500 cubits divided by 6 means that this measurement, 500 cubits, equals 83 reeds, okay? Now, I worked out the proportion of each one. So this would be 83 reeds by 83. And this outside would be 500 by 500 reeds. Okay, so it's all in reeds. And the point being that the sanctuary, this section, only takes up 2.76% of the dimensions that are described in Ezekiel's vision. 97% of Ezekiel's vision is not actually talked about in Ezekiel's prophecy. Ezekiel does this. He starts on the outside and he goes in and back out. What he doesn't talk about is this section. So why then such big dimensions? Well, Mark Golfrey in his book does this, and this isn't anything about where anything is. It's just in terms of proportion. Jerusalem as a city in New Testament times fits well within the 500 reeds, the mile by a mile. And this is the sanctuary. This is all to scale, I think. This is Herod's Temple Mount, Jerusalem in temple in the New Testament times. All fits way within this mile by mile that's mentioned in Ezekiel. So I think we can actually build on this idea. I called the title of this second one, Walking Through the Holy City of Jerusalem. We read about the city of the great king. In Zechariah, we read about God returning to Jerusalem and his house being built in it. So the house of God, the temple, is built inside Jerusalem. Jeremiah 30, the city is rebuilt upon its mound. The city. What do we think it means when it says city? What is the city of the great king? What is the city that is rebuilt upon its mound? Now, again, this isn't so clear, but you can see that there is Jerusalem, and at Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem, there is a temple, because of thy temple at Jerusalem. Awake, awake, Isaiah 52, put on thy strength, O Zion. Put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Jerusalem in the kingdom age is a city. And we read this last week. There shall yet be old men and old women dwelling in the streets of Jerusalem, and the streets of the city are full of boys and girls. In the streets thereof. Streets, and streets again, and a city, which is Jerusalem. The kingdom age talks about a city, and the city of Jerusalem. The prophets envision the Jerusalem of the age to come as the ideal, that, the holy city. Men like David, Solomon, Hezekiah, Josiah, in their lifetimes, that they only dream of what Jerusalem might look like one day, as a city with people, as a city with streets, with the sanctuary, the city of the great king, the place from which the law would go forth. I think that the huge dimensions at the end of chapter 42 are giving us the details of not only the temple, but also the city of Jerusalem. And I think that the captives by the river Kibar would know precisely what Ezekiel was talking about. They would know what it means to go through the eastern gate, to go outside the city. They would understand, and perhaps we're a bit more removed from that, but still it's there. They read of a greater and a holier Jerusalem than they remembered, but it is in some respects the same. We're coming towards the end. I just want to add slightly more detail to this picture. I mentioned last week that the temple would be built in a very similar spot to where it was before. Two passages in this regard: Zechariah 14 and Jeremiah 31. Sometimes it's easy to take Ezekiel as like the temple prophecies in a vacuum, and forget that, of course, all of these other places talk about the city of Jerusalem as well. And we don't want to talk about the topography and the geography of the land of Israel at this point, but rather just the buildings. Just focus on the buildings. Obviously, the land is changed. We read about that in Zechariah, Mount of Olives, splits in two. But what's important for us now is just the buildings. Okay, so Jerusalem is inhabited in her place there in Zechariah, from Benjamin's gate, remember that, unto the place of the first gate, or that should be the old gate or the ancient gate, unto the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananiel unto the king's wine presses, right? And then Jeremiah, behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that the city will be built, same again, from the tower of Hananiel unto the gate of the corner. That's the same as the corner gate in Zechariah 14. And the measuring line goes forth against the hill of Gareb and Goath. And there's a few more details in Jeremiah 31. Benjamin's gate, there. The tower of Hananiel, there. The old gate, that's the first gate in Zechariah, there. The corner gate, there. Here on this one, the old gate is this one. The tower of Hananiel is this one. Benjamin's gate is this one. The corner tower is this one. Now, this is, I think, really an incredible thing, but is it a coincidence that all of the gates that are mentioned are along the Temple Mount itself here? The writers use such specific language, and it gets you thinking about actual Jerusalem itself. I think the message is hammered home here that these places will be rebuilt. It says the palaces will be rebuilt as in the former times, Jeremiah says. And it doesn't mean, of course, that the city is rebuilt exactly the same. And it doesn't mean there are no changes to the land of Israel, but the implication is clear here. If the Tower of Hananiel is to be built, if the gate of the corner is there, if Benjamin's gate is there, if the old gate is there, where's the Temple Mount? And the answer is there. You know, it's like you can't have the Tower of Hananel without the Temple Mount. That's like having the Twin Towers, but only one of them. It's, you know, it doesn't work. The Tower of Hananel is in the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. It's part of it in a way. I think that by the prophets being so specific about these measurements, these places around Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is almost certainly rebuilt in the same place. Now, if you just turn, we are coming towards the end, but just turn with me to Jeremiah 31. There are just a few other specifications there as well, and I think this is really interesting. Again, it gets us thinking. It's like the reality of Jerusalem in the Kingdom Age. This is the reality of the temple rebuilt. So the end of Jeremiah 31, which is where we read the verse that was on the screen before. Behold, verse 38, the days come, saith Yahweh, that the city shall be built to Yahweh from the tower of Hananel unto the gate of the corner. The measuring line shall yet go forth over against Gareb and compass about Goath. Now, those two places, we don't have time to look at them tonight. Uncle Lane says they're on the west of Jerusalem. So on the map, that's about here. And it's talking about Hezekiah's extension that he made to Jerusalem with the broad wall. So here, this section is on the western side. That's Gareb and Goath. And then verse 40, and the whole valley of dead bodies and of the ashes. And I think that's actually fair to say that in a latter day context, that's probably the valley of Hinnom. And all the fields unto the brook Kidron, that's the Kidron Valley, down through here, unto the corner of the horse gate. The horse gate is here, or here, on this one, on this side. All of that is holy unto Yahweh, and shall not be plucked up nor thrown down anymore. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that in those two verses, Jeremiah has just described each direction. He describes all of these along the top, the Tower of Hananel, the northern direction. He describes Gareb and Goath on the western side. He describes the valley of Hinnom at the very bottom, right? And then he describes the Kidron down here, and he mentions the fields that will lead up. So these fields will still be fields, right? And they will be there as holy unto Yahweh. And I think they'll form part of the gardens that are down here that are the king's wine presses that are mentioned in Zechariah 14. Just on this picture, this accentuates the valleys. So the Kidron, of course, and of course, we're not saying that the topography is entirely the same, but we have to at least know where these places are in terms of what Jeremiah means. So the horse gate is there, and the Kidron is described. The valley of Hinnom goes off here, so at the very south, right? And then the western Goath and Gareb is here, and the towers there along the top. All of those, that's area, is described here as being rebuilt, here as being fields, here as being a valley, in the valley of Hinnom, right? The valley that's full of dead bodies. These are the visions of Jerusalem of the age to come. And I think it's just useful to visualize some of those exact details. And it just reminds us that we can't think of Ezekiel's prophecy in a vacuum. Ezekiel gives us the vision of the sanctuary, yes, but not necessarily the rest of Jerusalem. So that's our structure that we looked at, and that's the structure of the sanctuary itself. And then the temple itself is in chapter 41, and we looked at that. Chapter 42 is the chambers here that we never mentioned. And then the end of chapter 42 explains this vast space that's left, and also explains that the east gate is a joining onto the outer wall. We'll just finish with a few verses from Micah. And thou, O tower of the flock, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, unto thee shall it come, even the first or the old dominion. The kingdom shall come unto the daughter of Zion. This is the kingdom of God that is built upon the ruins of the kingdom of man, the restored kingdom of David. This is what we set our hearts upon and what we see when we look at these visions in the prophecy of Ezekiel and in Jeremiah as well. The kingdom of Israel restored, the first dominion. May we set our hearts upon this. And we begin where we end where we started. David, the faith of David. Just look at what he describes in the kingdom age. The house of Yahweh, Jerusalem builded as a city, the gates of Jerusalem, the thrones, the peace of Jerusalem, the walls, the palaces, the house again. Jerusalem is the place of the house of Yahweh, we know from verse 1. Jerusalem, we know from verse 3, is builded as a city. This really caps off everything we've been saying, right? We know that Jerusalem is a royal city, verse 6. There are set thrones of judgment, and not just a royal city, but the royal city of the Davidic monarchy, right? The thrones of the house of David. It's a city of peace, the peace of Jerusalem. There are walls, there are palaces, and again, there is a house in the middle of it. That is the biblical picture of the rebuilt Jerusalem in one psalm, and that is the faith of David, who never even saw the temple being built. And yet one day he will be glad when they say unto him, let us go up to the house of Yahweh. So let us set our affection on the house of God as David did, and have the same faith as David. And as Jeremiah said, let Jerusalem come into our minds. And in fact, that's another one of those in the Hebrew, that is, let Jerusalem ascend upon our hearts. That is the Hebrew of the verse there in Jeremiah. And let us remember the joy that is set before us, and we wait for the day when God will return in mercy and dwell in the midst of Jerusalem as he has promised.